Have you ever wondered how the most vulnerable women in medieval society managed to survive the brutal winters that claimed thousands of lives each year? Picture this: snow piling up to the second-story windows, temperatures so cold that wine froze solid in goblets, and heating fuel so expensive that only the wealthy could afford warmth. Now imagine you're a woman working in a medieval brothel, already living on society's margins, facing these deadly conditions with almost no resources or protection. The answer isn't what you'd expect, and it reveals one of the most fascinating survival stories from the darkest period in European history. These women didn't just survive through luck or charity. They developed an intricate network of survival strategies that were so effective they actually thrived during seasons when nobles and merchants were struggling to stay alive. I'm going to reveal the 6 ingenious methods brothel women used to not only survive, but prosper during medieval winters. These techniques were so closely guarded that historians only discovered them by studying court records, tax documents, and confessional manuscripts that were hidden away for centuries. What you're about to learn will completely change how you think about medieval society and the resourcefulness of women who had absolutely nothing except their wits. But first, let me show you just how deadly these winters really were. The winter of 1315 was so severe that chroniclers called it the beginning of the Great Famine. Rivers froze solid for months. Livestock died in massive numbers. Even wealthy lords rationed bread. The winter of 1348 brought not just cold, but the Black Death, turning every town into a frozen graveyard. And the winter of 1709 was so brutal that the Thames River in London froze completely solid, and people could walk across it carrying heavy carts. These weren't just inconvenient cold snaps. These were survival scenarios that tested every aspect of medieval ingenuity. So how did women with the least social protection and fewest resources manage to make it through when others didn't? The first strategy they used was something historians call the heat economy. While wealthy families hoarded firewood and charcoal for their private chambers, brothel women created communal warming systems that were actually more efficient than anything the nobility had access to. They would pool their meager resources to purchase cheap, low-quality fuel that burned fast but generated intense heat for short periods. Then they developed a rotation system where different rooms would be heated at different times throughout the day and night. But here's where it gets really clever. They realized that body heat from multiple people could maintain warmth long after the fires died down. So they created sleeping arrangements where women would share beds not just for companionship, but as a calculated survival strategy. 3 or 4 women sleeping together could maintain body temperature through the coldest nights, even when there was no fuel left for heating. They also discovered that certain foods could actually raise body temperature from the inside. While nobles were eating cold preserved meats and stale bread, brothel women were consuming specific combinations of spices, heated wines, and warming broths that kept their internal furnaces burning. They traded sexual services for access to kitchens where they could prepare these warming meals, often cooking in the early morning hours when kitchens retained heat from the previous day's cooking. The second survival method was what I call the clothing conspiracy. Medieval clothing was expensive, and brothel women couldn't afford the thick woolen garments that protected wealthy families. So they developed an underground clothing sharing network that spanned entire cities. When a woman acquired a warm cloak or thick stockings, either through trade or as payment, it wouldn't stay with her permanently. Instead, these warming garments would rotate through the community based on who needed them most at any given time. A woman working outdoors would get priority access to the warmest outer garments. Someone who was sick would get the thickest blankets. This created a clothing library system centuries before anyone thought to apply that concept to books. They also mastered the art of layering in ways that nobles never learned. While wealthy women wore single heavy garments, brothel women would layer multiple thin pieces of cloth, creating air pockets that trapped body heat more effectively than expensive furs. They learned to wrap their feet in multiple layers of fabric scraps, creating primitive but effective insulation that worked better than the leather boots worn by merchants. But perhaps most ingeniously, they learned to modify their work clothing to provide maximum warmth while still appearing attractive to clients. They developed techniques for sewing thin layers of wool or cotton batting into the linings of their dresses, creating insulation that was completely invisible. They also learned to use cosmetics and perfumes that created warming sensations on the skin, giving the illusion of warmth even in freezing temperatures. The third strategy was shelter manipulation. Brothels were typically located in the poorest quarters of medieval towns, which meant they occupied the buildings with the worst heating and the most drafts. But these women became masters at modifying their living spaces to trap and redirect heat in ways that would impress modern engineers. They learned to hang heavy fabrics from ceilings to create smaller, more easily heated spaces within larger cold rooms. They discovered that certain arrangements of furniture could redirect heat from small fires to warm specific areas where they spent the most time. They even developed primitive ventilation systems using hollow reeds and fabric tubes to move warm air from cooking areas to sleeping spaces. Some brothels would actually modify their buildings during summer months, preparing for winter by blocking unnecessary windows, creating double walls with insulating materials like straw or rags, and even digging small root cellars beneath their floors where they could retreat during the coldest nights. They also mastered the timing of when to be indoors versus outdoors. While other people would venture out during the coldest parts of the day, brothel women learned to schedule their activities around natural temperature patterns. They would do outdoor tasks during the brief, warm periods around midday, and they would time their indoor work for early morning and evening hours when their small heating fires would be most effective. The fourth method was the alliance system. Medieval society was built on rigid hierarchies, but winter survival required flexibility that those hierarchies couldn't provide. Brothel women created informal alliances with people from completely different social classes, trading their services for access to resources that would otherwise be impossible to obtain. They developed relationships with blacksmiths who could provide access to forge heat during the coldest days. They traded with stable boys who could share the warmth of animal shelters. They even created arrangements with monastery kitchens where they could access warm food and heated spaces in exchange for services that the religious institutions officially condemned but privately tolerated. These alliances were carefully managed and kept secret from authorities who would have punished both parties if discovered, but they created survival networks that were more effective than the official charity. Most importantly, they learned to form systems that supposedly existed to help the poor. Perhaps partnerships with other marginalized groups who faced similar survival challenges. Traveling merchants, foreign workers, and even criminals would share resources and information about where to find warmth, food, and shelter during the hardest months. The fifth survival strategy was what historians now recognize as early forms of food preservation and storage that were more advanced than techniques used by wealthy households. While nobles relied on expensive imported preserved foods, brothel women learned to create nutritious warming meals from scraps and ingredients that others discarded. They developed fermentation techniques that not only preserved food through winter months, but actually increased its nutritional value. They learned to make warming alcoholic drinks from fruits and grains that would otherwise spoil, creating beverages that provided both calories and body heat. They even mastered smoking and drying techniques that turned cheap cuts of meat into protein sources that could last for months. But their real innovation was in creating food-sharing networks that ensured no one in their community went hungry, even during the worst shortages. They developed rotating feast systems where different women would take turns providing meals for the entire group, spreading the burden of food acquisition while ensuring everyone had access to warm, nutritious food. They also learned to trade food preparation services for raw ingredients, working in the kitchens of wealthier households in exchange for access to cooking facilities and leftover ingredients that they could take back to their community. The sixth, and perhaps most crucial method, was information trading. Knowledge was power in medieval society, and brothel women had access to information that no other group possessed. They learned which merchants were arriving with heating fuel, which households were discarding still useful clothing, and which authorities might be willing to overlook certain survival activities in exchange for information or services. They created intelligence networks that spanned entire regions, sharing information about weather patterns, resource availability, and survival opportunities. A woman in one town would send word to colleagues in other locations about upcoming opportunities or threats, creating an early warning system that helped entire communities prepare for the worst conditions. This information trading also extended to sharing survival techniques and innovations. When one woman discovered a new way to stay warm or preserve food, that knowledge would spread quickly through the network, ensuring that successful strategies were adopted by everyone who could benefit from them. Now, before I reveal the most shocking discovery about how these survival methods actually changed medieval society itself, you need to understand something that historians kept hidden for centuries. The success of these survival strategies was so remarkable that they actually began to threaten the established social order. When the most marginalized women in society were not only surviving, but thriving during conditions that killed members of the nobility, it raised questions that powerful people didn't want answered. Court records from this period show something extraordinary happening. Tax collectors began noticing that certain districts populated by brothels were actually generating more revenue during winter months than during summer. This wasn't supposed to be possible. According to everything medieval society understood about economics and social hierarchy, the poorest areas should have been the first to collapse during harsh conditions. But these women had discovered something that wouldn't be formally recognized by economists for another 500 years. They had created what we now call resilient economic networks. Instead of relying on individual wealth accumulation like the nobility, they had built systems where resources flowed continuously through their communities, ensuring that everyone had access to what they needed exactly when they needed it. The evidence for this comes from confession records that priests were required to keep. These documents reveal that during the worst winter months, brothel districts were actually supporting not just their own members, but also destitute families, abandoned children, and even impoverished craftsmen who had lost their workshops to economic collapse. What's even more remarkable is how they managed their client relationships during winter months. While you might assume that harsh conditions would reduce demand for their services, these women actually discovered ways to increase their income precisely when survival resources were most expensive. They learned that men from wealthy families were willing to pay premium prices not just for companionship, but for access to the warming techniques and survival knowledge that these women had developed. Rich merchants would actually hire brothel women as consultants to help their own households survive difficult winters. Nobles would pay for access to the food preservation techniques and heating strategies that had proven more effective than anything their own servants could provide. This created an unprecedented situation where knowledge flowed upward through social hierarchies instead of downward. The seventh method they developed was seasonal migration, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of leaving their home cities during winter, they learned to move strategically within urban areas to take advantage of microclimate differences and resource availability patterns that change throughout the cold months. Medieval cities weren't uniformly cold. Certain districts retained heat better due to building density, wind patterns, and proximity to workshops that generated warmth. Brothel women mapped these thermal zones with scientific precision that wouldn't be matched by urban planners until the modern era. They knew exactly which streets would be warmest at different times of day, which buildings offered the best shelter from particular wind directions, and which locations provided access to residual heat from various commercial activities. During the coldest weeks, Entire communities of these women would temporarily relocate to the most advantageous thermal zones, often setting up temporary shelters in areas that appeared unsuitable to casual observers, but actually provided superior protection from the elements. They would return to their regular locations once conditions improved, but this strategic mobility gave them survival advantages that completely stationary populations couldn't achieve. They also developed seasonal work migration patterns, moving their services to follow demand from different economic sectors that remained active during winter months. When shipping activity decreased in port districts, they would shift their focus to areas near workshops that continued operating through cold months. When certain crafts shut down for the season, they would relocate to serve industries that actually increased production during winter. The eighth survival innovation was medical knowledge that was centuries ahead of its time. Medieval medicine was primitive and often dangerous, but brothel women couldn't afford to get sick during winter months when medical care was least available and most expensive. So they developed their own healthcare systems based on practical experience and careful observation of what actually worked. They learned to recognize the early signs of frostbite, hypothermia, and winter-related illnesses, developing treatment protocols that were more effective than anything trained physicians could provide. They discovered herbal remedies that could prevent and treat respiratory infections that killed thousands of people every winter. They even developed primitive surgical techniques for treating injuries that occurred more frequently during icy conditions. But their most important medical innovation was preventive care. They created hygiene routines, dietary protocols, and physical conditioning programs that kept their communities healthier during winter months than most wealthy families who had access to professional medical care. They understood that prevention was far more cost-effective than treatment, especially when treatment options were limited and expensive. They also served as informal medical practitioners for their broader communities, treating not just their own members, but also clients and neighbors who couldn't afford professional physicians. This created additional income streams while building social relationships that provided mutual protection during the most dangerous months. The ninth method was what modern economists would recognize as futures trading and resource speculation. These women learned to predict price fluctuations for essential survival resources months in advance, allowing them to acquire what they needed when prices were lowest, and sometimes even profit by trading surplus resources when scarcity drove prices higher. They developed sophisticated understanding of supply chains for heating fuel, preserved foods, and warm clothing. They knew which resources would become scarce first during harsh winters, which alternative sources might become available, and how to position themselves to take advantage of these market dynamics. During summer months, they would pool resources to purchase winter supplies at low seasonal prices, storing them in carefully managed community stockpiles. They learned preservation techniques that allowed them to maintain the quality of these stored resources for months, without the expensive storage facilities that wealthy merchants used. But they also learned to diversify their resource portfolios, avoiding dependence on any single type of heating fuel, food source, or protective equipment. When one resource became unavailable or prohibitively expensive, they had alternatives ready. This redundancy planning was more sophisticated than the resource management strategies used by most noble households. The 10th and perhaps most ingenious survival method was reputation management that turned their marginalized social status into a survival advantage. While respectable societies shunned them during normal times, these women learned to leverage their outsider status to access resources and opportunities that were unavailable to people who had to maintain conventional social appearances. They could trade with criminals, outcasts, and foreign merchants without damaging their social standing because they had no conventional social standing to protect. This gave them access to black market resources, alternative supply chains, and survival strategies that law-abiding citizens couldn't pursue without risking their positions in society. They also learned to use their reputation as a form of protection. Authorities who might normally harass or exploit them were sometimes willing to overlook their activities during winter months because these women provided services and resources that helped maintain social stability during crisis conditions. Local officials began to recognize that brothel districts were actually more stable and less prone to winter riots or crime waves than other poor areas. The survival networks these women had created were so effective at meeting basic needs that they prevented the desperate behavior that often emerged in other communities during harsh conditions. What happened next would change everything, because the success of these survival methods caught the attention of people who had the power to either destroy or legitimize these innovations, and their decision would determine whether these survival strategies remained hidden secrets or became the foundation for entirely new approaches to winter survival that would spread throughout medieval Europe. The authorities' response was swift and decisive, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of shutting down these survival networks, powerful figures began secretly adopting the techniques for their own households. Court records from the Abbey of Saint-Denis reveal that by 1320, several noble families were quietly implementing communal heating strategies and food-sharing systems that were identical to methods developed in brothel communities. The church faced a particularly complex dilemma. These survival innovations were undeniably saving lives, including the lives of devout Christians who had been abandoned by traditional charity systems. But they were being developed and led by women whose very existence challenged religious teachings about morality and social order. Confessional records show that priests began receiving instructions to quietly encourage these survival practices, while officially condemning the women who created them. What emerged was a shadow economy of survival knowledge that operated parallel to official medieval society. Wealthy merchants would send their servants to learn from brothel women, then implement these techniques in their own households while maintaining public disapproval of their teachers. Noble ladies would secretly adopt food preservation methods and clothing modification techniques, spreading them through their social networks while never acknowledging their true origins. This created an unprecedented situation where innovation flowed upward through social hierarchies in direct contradiction to everything medieval society believed about knowledge and authority. The most marginalized women in Europe had become inadvertent teachers to the most powerful families, fundamentally altering survival practices across entire social classes. The economic implications were staggering. By 1325, tax records from major cities show that winter mortality rates in districts with established brothel communities were consistently lower than rates in wealthy merchant quarters. This wasn't just statistical noise. These women had developed survival systems so effective that they were literally keeping more people alive than the official support structures maintained by church and state. But their influence extended beyond mere survival. The collaborative resource management techniques they pioneered began appearing in craft guilds, merchant associations, and even monastery communities. The rotating responsibility systems they used for heating and food preparation became models for organizing seasonal labor in industries ranging from textile production to metalworking. Perhaps most remarkably, their information trading networks evolved into what historians now recognize as Europe's first systematic weather prediction systems. By sharing observations about wind patterns, animal behavior, and seasonal timing across vast geographic areas, these women could predict harsh weather conditions weeks in advance. This knowledge became so valuable that some noble households began paying regular fees for access to these forecasts. The medical innovations they developed had equally profound impacts. Their herbal remedies and preventive care protocols began appearing in monastery infirmaries and noble households throughout Northern Europe. Physicians who had initially dismissed these treatments as superstition gradually began incorporating them into their own practices, though they rarely acknowledged their sources. Their understanding of nutrition during scarcity conditions proved especially influential. The warming food combinations and preservation techniques they developed became standard practices in military campaigns, long-distance trading expeditions, and frontier settlements. These nutritional strategies were so effective that they actually improved the survival rates of soldiers and explorers who faced harsh conditions far from established supply lines. The clothing modification techniques they pioneered spread through every social class, though wealthy families disguised them as fashion innovations rather than survival necessities. The layering strategies and insulation methods they developed became standard elements of winter clothing throughout medieval Europe, influencing textile production and clothing design for centuries. Their shelter modification innovations had similarly far-reaching effects. The heat redirection techniques and space optimization strategies they developed were quietly adopted by architects and builders working on projects for wealthy clients. Castle designers began incorporating ventilation systems and heating efficiency improvements that were based directly on methods developed in brothel communities. By 1350, the survival techniques these women had developed were so widely adopted that they had fundamentally altered how European society approached winter survival. Yet their contributions remained officially unrecognized, creating a historical paradox where some of the most important innovations of the medieval period were attributed to anonymous tradition rather than their actual creators. The social consequences were equally complex. The success of these survival networks began attracting women from other marginalized groups who sought to join these communities not for the work, but for the protection and resources they provided. Widows, orphans, and women fleeing abusive situations discovered that brothel communities offered survival opportunities that were unavailable through official charity channels. This created internal tensions within these communities as they struggled to balance their original survival focus with growing responsibilities as informal social safety nets. They developed sophisticated screening processes to identify women who genuinely needed protection versus those who might exploit or undermine their carefully constructed systems. They also had to navigate increasingly complex relationships with local authorities who were simultaneously benefiting from their innovations while maintaining official disapproval of their existence. This required diplomatic skills that went far beyond simple survival techniques, as they learned to negotiate protection agreements that allowed their communities to operate while satisfying official requirements for moral enforcement. The economic power these communities accumulated through their survival innovations created new challenges as well. As they became more successful at generating income during winter months, they attracted attention from criminal organizations that sought to exploit their resources. They had to develop security measures and defensive strategies that protected their communities without escalating conflicts that could bring unwanted official intervention. Their success also created competition from other marginalized groups who attempted to replicate their survival networks without understanding the social cooperation and trust building that made these systems effective. Some of these imitation networks failed catastrophically, creating situations where desperate people suffered even more severe hardships because they had abandoned traditional survival strategies for poorly implemented alternatives. The most significant long-term consequence was how these survival innovations influenced the development of urban planning and social organization throughout medieval Europe. Cities began recognizing that certain approaches to community resource management were more effective at maintaining social stability than traditional hierarchical distribution systems. Municipal authorities started experimenting with policies that encouraged resource sharing and collaborative survival strategies, though they carefully avoided any official acknowledgement of where these ideas originated. Public works projects began incorporating heating efficiency improvements and community shelter designs that were based directly on innovations developed in brothel districts. The influence extended to rural communities as well, where farming families began adopting food preservation techniques and seasonal resource management strategies that had proven effective in urban survival networks. These agricultural applications of survival innovations helped rural communities weather harsh seasons more effectively, reducing the migration pressures that had historically driven desperate people into cities during winter months. religious institutions found themselves in increasingly complex positions as they recognized the effectiveness of survival methods that contradicted their teachings about social hierarchy and individual moral responsibility. Some monasteries began quietly implementing resource-sharing systems that were identical to those developed by brothel communities, while maintaining official positions that condemned the women who had created these innovations. The intellectual implications were equally profound, though they wouldn't be fully recognized for centuries. These women had developed sophisticated understanding of economics, resource management, social organization, and even primitive scientific observation that challenged fundamental assumptions about knowledge and authority in medieval society. Their empirical approach to problem solving, based on careful observation and systematic testing of survival strategies, represented an early form of scientific methodology that preceded formal academic recognition of experimental approaches by several hundred years. They had created knowledge through practice and verification rather than through authority and tradition, fundamentally challenging how medieval society understood the creation and validation of useful information. The collaborative decision-making processes they developed for managing their survival networks also represented innovations in governance and social organization that wouldn't be formally recognized by political theorists until much later periods. They had created democratic resource allocation systems and collective problem-solving approaches that operated effectively within the rigid hierarchical structures of medieval society. As winter after winter demonstrated the effectiveness of their survival methods, these innovations began spreading beyond the specific communities that had created them. The techniques became embedded in broader survival culture throughout Northern Europe, though their origins were gradually forgotten or deliberately obscured as they were adopted by more socially acceptable groups. By 1400, many of the survival strategies that had originated in brothel communities had become standard practices for winter survival throughout medieval Europe, implemented by families and communities across all social classes. The warming techniques, resource-sharing systems, food preservation methods, and shelter modifications had become so thoroughly integrated into survival culture that few people remembered or acknowledged their true sources. This process of cultural absorption meant that some of the most important survival innovations of the medieval period became anonymous traditions rather than recognized contributions from specific communities. The women who had developed these life-saving techniques were written out of the historical record, even as their innovations continued to save thousands of lives every winter. The ultimate irony was that the very success of these survival methods led to their creators being forgotten, as the techniques became so widely adopted that they seemed like natural developments rather than deliberate innovations created by resourceful communities facing desperate circumstances. What's truly remarkable is how these forgotten innovations actually laid the groundwork for survival techniques that we still use today. Modern emergency preparedness experts recommend many strategies that are essentially refined versions of methods these medieval women developed centuries ago. Community resource sharing during disasters, rotating heating schedules during power outages, collaborative food preservation, and neighborhood information networks all trace their origins back to these survival systems. But there's something even more fascinating that historians discovered when they started mapping the geographic spread of these techniques. The survival methods didn't spread randomly across medieval Europe. They followed very specific patterns that reveal an underground network of communication and trade that was far more sophisticated than anyone previously understood. Archaeological evidence from excavations in former brothel districts shows that these communities were importing specialized materials from locations hundreds of miles away. Clay pipes for ventilation systems were coming from specific quarries in northern France. Certain herbs used in their warming remedies were being transported from monasteries in the German states. Fabric fibers used in their insulation techniques were arriving from textile centers in the Low Countries. This means these women had established trade relationships that spanned the entire continent, creating supply chains that operated completely outside the official merchant networks that historians had always assumed controlled medieval commerce. They were running what amounted to a parallel economy, that was invisible to tax collectors and regulatory authorities, but sophisticated enough to move specialized goods across thousands of miles. The coordination required for this system was staggering. A woman in Paris needed to know that a specific type of clay was available in Normandy, arrange payment and transport, and coordinate delivery timing with seasonal survival needs. Someone in London had to establish relationships with herb suppliers in Bavaria and ensure that medicinal plants arrived before winter conditions made them most necessary. This reveals something about medieval communication systems that completely changes how we understand information flow during this period. These women had created messaging networks that could coordinate complex logistics across vast distances with timing precision that rival modern supply chain management. They were essentially operating medieval Europe's first integrated continental distribution system. The evidence for this comes from municipal records that tracked unusual trading patterns during winter months. Port cities began noting that certain types of goods were arriving in quantities that didn't match official merchant orders. Small coastal towns were receiving shipments of specialized materials that local populations couldn't possibly afford or use. Border crossing records show patterns of movement that didn't correspond to any known trade routes. What was happening was that survival materials were being moved through a network of intermediaries who understood exactly which resources were needed in which locations at precisely what times. A fishing village might receive a shipment of thermal clay, but rather than using it locally, they would transport it inland to communities that needed it for heating improvements. A farming town might import more wool than their population required, then distribute the surplus to urban networks that used it for insulation projects. This underground economy was so efficient that it actually began affecting official trade patterns. Legitimate merchants started noticing that certain survival-related goods were becoming harder to source during winter months because unofficial networks were purchasing them first. Some established trading houses began losing market share for winter supplies because they couldn't compete with the speed and precision of the distribution systems these women had created. The most incredible part is how they managed payment across these vast networks without the banking systems that wealthy merchants relied on. They developed credit arrangements and resource exchange agreements that allowed communities in one region to receive materials immediately while providing compensation through different goods or services that might not be delivered until months later. A brothel community in northern England might receive warming spices from Mediterranean suppliers in October, with payment coming in the form of preserved fish products that wouldn't be available until spring fishing seasons. German communities might provide metalworking services for heating equipment in exchange for textile materials that would be delivered the following summer. This required record-keeping systems and trust networks that were more sophisticated than the financial instruments used by international banking houses. These women had to track complex multi-party exchanges across seasonal cycles, geographic distances, and language barriers, all while maintaining secrecy that protected their operations from official interference. The trust component was particularly remarkable because these arrangements often involved communities that had never met face-to-face and might never have any direct contact except through the goods and services they exchanged. A woman in Sicily had to trust that her winter fuel shipments to Scotland would eventually be compensated through spring textile deliveries arranged by intermediaries in 3 different countries. Yet the system worked so reliably that it operated for decades without the contract enforcement mechanisms that official commerce depended on. The reputation networks these communities had created were apparently more effective at ensuring compliance than legal systems that could be corrupted or circumvented through wealth and political influence. The cultural implications were equally profound. These trade networks meant that survival innovations developed in one region could spread across the entire continent within a single season. A heating improvement discovered in Norway could be implemented in Italy before the same winter was over. Food preservation techniques developed in Spain could be saving lives in Poland within months of their creation. This created an acceleration of innovation that was unprecedented in medieval Europe. Instead of new techniques taking decades or centuries to spread through official channels, survival improvements were being shared across continental distances at speeds that wouldn't be matched again until the development of modern communication technologies. The intellectual exchange that accompanied this material trade was equally remarkable. Women who never left their home cities were learning about weather patterns, resource availability, and survival techniques from dozens of different regions. They were accumulating knowledge about continental climate systems, geographic resource distribution, and seasonal timing variations that surpassed anything available to scholars and administrators. This knowledge synthesis enabled them to develop survival strategies that were optimized for specific regional conditions, while drawing on innovations from completely different environments. They could adapt Mediterranean food preservation techniques for Northern European conditions, modify Scandinavian heating methods for use in temperate climates, and combine textile innovations from multiple regions to create insulation systems that worked effectively anywhere. The scientific implications of this knowledge sharing were extraordinary, though they wouldn't be recognized until much later periods. These women were essentially conducting continent-wide experiments in survival technology, with results being shared, tested, and refined across dozens of different environmental conditions simultaneously. They developed understanding of resource management, logistics coordination, and social organization that was based on practical experience across geographic and cultural scales that no other group in medieval society could access. Their knowledge was empirically derived from testing and verification rather than theoretical speculation, making it more reliable than much of the formal academic knowledge of their time. But perhaps most importantly, they had created proof of concept for collaborative problem-solving approaches that challenged fundamental assumptions about how knowledge creation and resource distribution should work in medieval society. They had demonstrated that decentralized networks could be more effective than hierarchical systems, that collaborative decision-making could produce better outcomes than authoritarian control, and that innovation could emerge from marginalized communities more effectively than from established institutions. The political implications of this success were potentially explosive. If the most despised women in medieval society could create systems that were more effective than official institutions at keeping people alive, what did that say about the competence and legitimacy of those who claimed authority based on birth, wealth, or religious appointment? Church and state authorities were facing a crisis of legitimacy that they couldn't acknowledge without undermining their own positions. The survival networks these women had created were saving more lives than official charity systems. Their trade networks were more efficient than regulated commerce, and their knowledge systems were producing more reliable results than academic institutions. The response from established power structures was predictably complex. They couldn't openly suppress systems that were clearly beneficial to overall social stability, but they couldn't acknowledge or legitimize innovations that challenged their authority. So they began a careful process of appropriation that would allow them to claim credit for successful techniques, while maintaining condemnation of their creators. Religious authorities started incorporating survival techniques into their charity work, while attributing them to divine inspiration rather than human innovation. Noble households began implementing resource management systems while claiming they were traditional practices that had always been used by proper families. Municipal authorities started adopting community organization methods while presenting them as administrative reforms developed by official planners. This appropriation process was so thorough that within a few generations, the true origins of many survival innovations had been completely obscured. Techniques that had been developed through careful experimentation and collaborative problem-solving were rewritten as ancient wisdom or natural developments that had emerged spontaneously from proper social structures. The women whose ingenuity had created these life-saving systems found themselves in the peculiar position of watching their innovations being celebrated, while their contributions were denied or forgotten. They had succeeded so completely at solving survival problems that their solutions had become part of mainstream culture. But this success had made them historically invisible. Yet their influence continued to operate through the survival techniques themselves, even as their contributions were erased from official records. Every family that used communal heating strategies, every community that implemented resource-sharing systems, and every household that applied their food preservation methods was unknowingly benefiting from innovations created by women whose names were never recorded in history books. The ultimate legacy of these survival innovations extends far beyond their immediate effectiveness during medieval winters. They established principles of community cooperation, resource optimization, and collaborative problem-solving that would influence social organization for centuries to come. They demonstrated that effective solutions to complex challenges could emerge from unexpected sources, and that survival often depended more on social cooperation than individual resources. Their success also established precedents for underground networks, alternative economies, and decentralized organization that would reappear throughout European history whenever official systems failed to meet basic human needs. The techniques they developed for operating outside established authority structures while maintaining internal stability became models for resistance movements, economic cooperatives, and social reform organizations. But perhaps their most important contribution was proving that innovation and leadership could emerge from the most marginalized members of society when they were given opportunities to collaborate and experiment. They showed that effective solutions often came from those who face problems most directly, rather than from those who held official responsibility for solving them. The survival networks these medieval brothel women created saved thousands of lives, influenced social organization across an entire continent, and established principles of community cooperation that continue to inspire social innovations today. Their story reveals that some of the most important developments in human society have come from sources that official history has chosen to ignore or forget. Their techniques worked because they were based on practical testing rather than theoretical authority, collaborative decision-making rather than hierarchical control, and shared responsibility rather than individual accumulation. These principles proved more effective at ensuring survival than the official systems that were supposed to provide security and support. What makes their story even more remarkable is how these survival innovations began influencing the very structure of medieval cities themselves. Urban planners today would recognize what these women accidentally created as the first examples of resilient urban design, centuries before anyone understood the concepts they were implementing. Archaeological excavations in former brothel districts reveal building modifications that were far ahead of their time. These women learned to create what we now call thermal corridors, connecting multiple buildings through underground passages and covered walkways that allowed communities to move between heated spaces without exposure to deadly cold. They essentially turned entire city blocks into integrated survival complexes. But they didn't stop at just connecting buildings. They learned to modify urban infrastructure in ways that created microclimates within the larger city environment. By strategically placing barriers to redirect wind patterns, installing reflective surfaces to concentrate available sunlight, and creating sheltered courtyards that trapped warm air, they were able to raise temperatures in their districts by several crucial degrees during the coldest periods. The engineering knowledge required for these modifications was extraordinary. They had to understand wind dynamics, solar positioning, thermal retention, and structural integrity without any formal training in architecture or engineering. They learned through trial and error, careful observation, and systematic testing of different approaches until they discovered techniques that worked reliably. Some of their innovations were so effective that they actually began attracting residents from wealthier districts who couldn't achieve similar heating efficiency in their expensive homes. Tax records from the period show wealthy merchants and minor nobles secretly purchasing or renting properties in brothel districts during winter months. officially claiming they needed the locations for business purposes while actually seeking access to superior survival infrastructure. This created unprecedented social mixing that horrified traditional authorities, but proved impossible to prevent because the survival advantages were so compelling. Noble families found themselves living in the same buildings as the women they publicly condemned, creating daily interactions that began breaking down some of the rigid social barriers that defined medieval society. The knowledge transfer that occurred through these interactions was profound. Wealthy women learned practical skills from brothel workers that their expensive educations had never provided. They discovered food preparation techniques, clothing modification methods, and household management strategies that were more effective than anything their servants could teach them. Meanwhile, brothel women gained access to resources and information networks that had previously been completely unavailable to them. They learned about import schedules for luxury goods that could be adapted for survival purposes, discovered diplomatic and trade information that helped them predict resource shortages, and gained insights into legal and political systems that allowed them to better protect their communities. This bidirectional knowledge exchange created a synthesis of practical survival skills and institutional knowledge that produced innovations neither group could have developed alone. Wealthy women contributed understanding of large-scale resource management and political navigation, while brothel women provided tested techniques for efficiency, cooperation, and creative problem-solving. The results were survival systems that combined the resource access of the wealthy with the ingenuity of the desperate, creating approaches that were more effective than anything either social class had achieved independently. These hybrid systems became the foundation for survival strategies that spread throughout medieval Europe and influenced urban development for centuries. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was how these interactions began changing attitudes about knowledge creation and social hierarchy. When wealthy families discovered that their survival depended on techniques developed by women, they had always considered their social inferiors. It created cognitive dissonance that challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence, capability, and social worth. Some noble women began questioning why their expensive educations hadn't prepared them for practical challenges that these supposedly ignorant women had solved so effectively. They started recognizing that different types of intelligence and knowledge were valuable in different circumstances, and that formal education didn't necessarily produce better solutions than practical experience and collaborative experimentation. This recognition didn't immediately transform medieval social structures, but it planted seeds of doubt about the natural superiority of the wealthy and educated that would eventually contribute to broader social changes. The evidence that marginalized women could develop more effective solutions than established authorities became part of a growing body of experience that challenged traditional justifications for social hierarchy. The 11th survival method these women developed was what modern disaster preparedness experts would recognize as psychological resilience training. They understood that surviving harsh winters required not just physical resources, but mental strategies that could maintain morale and cooperation when conditions became desperate. They developed storytelling traditions, musical practices, and communal activities that served multiple survival functions simultaneously. Evening gatherings around shared heating sources weren't just social events. They were carefully structured activities that maintained group cohesion, shared practical knowledge, and provided emotional support that prevented the despair and panic that could destroy survival communities. These psychological survival techniques were based on deep understanding of human behavior under stress. They learned to recognize the early signs of depression, anxiety, and social conflict that could emerge during extended periods of hardship, and they developed intervention strategies that addressed these problems before they became destructive. They created rotation systems for leadership responsibilities that prevented any individual from becoming overwhelmed by decision-making burdens during crisis periods. They established conflict resolution procedures that could maintain community cooperation even when resources became scarce and tensions ran high. They developed communication protocols that ensured important information was shared effectively while preventing rumors and misinformation from creating panic. Their approach to managing fear was particularly sophisticated. Rather than trying to eliminate anxiety about survival challenges, they learned to channel fear into productive action that improved their actual safety. They taught each other to use worry as motivation for preparation and planning, rather than allowing it to become paralyzing terror. They also developed techniques for maintaining hope and motivation during the darkest periods of winter, when survival seemed most uncertain. They created celebration traditions that marked progress through difficult seasons, established reward systems that recognized individual and group achievements, and maintained future-oriented planning that kept communities focused on goals beyond immediate survival. These psychological survival methods were so effective that they began attracting attention from religious authorities who were struggling to maintain morale in their own communities during harsh winters. Some monasteries began adopting group activity structures and morale management techniques that were clearly based on methods developed in brothel communities, though they carefully avoided acknowledging their sources. The 12th innovation was advanced waste management and resource recovery that turned survival challenges into opportunities for creating additional resources. Medieval cities were notoriously unsanitary, and winter conditions made waste disposal even more problematic. But these women learned to turn waste streams into survival assets through recycling and repurposing techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. They developed systems for collecting and processing organic waste that could be converted into heating fuel through controlled decomposition processes. They learned to recover useful materials from discarded items that other people considered worthless, finding ways to repair, modify, and repurpose everything from damaged clothing to broken household implements. Their approach to human waste management was particularly innovative. They created composting systems that safely processed sewage while generating heat through bacterial decomposition, providing both sanitation and warming benefits that improved health outcomes while reducing fuel costs. They also learned to recover and purify water from sources that other people considered unusable, developing filtration and treatment methods that provided safe drinking water even when conventional sources were frozen or contaminated. These water recovery techniques were crucial for communities that couldn't afford the high prices that clean water commanded during winter shortages. Their waste processing innovations created secondary resource streams that provided materials for other survival activities. Processed organic waste became soil amendments for growing fresh food in protected indoor spaces. Recovered textiles became raw materials for insulation and weatherproofing projects. Salvaged metal items were converted into tools and equipment that improved heating efficiency and food preparation capabilities. These resource recovery systems were so comprehensive that brothel districts began generating less waste than other urban areas, while simultaneously producing more useful materials for survival activities. They had essentially created closed-loop resource cycles that maximized the utility of everything that entered their communities. The 13th method involved what we would now recognize as sophisticated logistics and supply chain management adapted for survival conditions. These women learned to predict, plan for, and respond to resource shortages with precision that rivaled modern emergency management systems. They developed inventory tracking systems that monitored consumption rates for essential survival resources, allowing them to predict when shortages would occur and take preventive action before crisis conditions developed. They maintained detailed records of seasonal patterns in resource availability and pricing that enabled them to optimize their purchasing and storage strategies. Their supply chain diversification was extraordinary. They established relationships with multiple suppliers for every critical resource, ensuring that shortages from one source wouldn't create survival emergencies. They learned to substitute different materials and resources when preferred options became unavailable, maintaining their survival capabilities even when specific supplies were interrupted. They also developed early warning networks that could alert communities about approaching resource shortages, price increases, or supply disruptions before they became critical problems. These information systems allowed them to take preventive action that avoided crisis situations rather than just responding to emergencies after they occurred. Their logistics planning extended to coordinating resource sharing between different communities when local shortages threatened individual groups. They created mutual aid agreements that ensured no single community would face survival crises alone, establishing resource pooling arrangements that could provide emergency support when needed. The 14th innovation was educational systems that ensured survival knowledge was preserved and transmitted effectively across generations. These women understood that their survival techniques were only valuable if they could be reliably taught to new community members and maintained over time. They developed training programs that taught essential survival skills through hands-on practice rather than theoretical instruction. New community members learned heating techniques, food preservation methods, and resource management strategies by working alongside experienced practitioners who could provide immediate feedback and correction. Their knowledge preservation systems were remarkably sophisticated. They created memory techniques, storytelling traditions, and ritual practices that encoded essential survival information in forms that could be accurately transmitted even by people who couldn't read or write. They developed quality control procedures that ensured survival techniques were performed correctly and safely. They also established mentorship relationships that paired experienced survival practitioners with newcomers, creating knowledge transfer systems that maintained skill levels while adapting techniques to changing conditions and resource availability. Their educational approach emphasized practical problem-solving skills rather than rote memorization of specific techniques. They taught people to understand the principles behind survival methods so they could adapt and modify approaches when circumstances changed, creating more resilient knowledge systems that could evolve with changing conditions. The 15th and final survival method was what modern organizational theorists would recognize as distributed leadership and collaborative decision-making systems that maintained community effectiveness even under extreme stress conditions. These women learned that survival communities couldn't depend on single leaders who might become incapacitated, make poor decisions under pressure, or become overwhelmed by responsibility burdens during crisis periods. Instead, they developed leadership structures that distributed authority and decision-making responsibilities across multiple community members. Their governance systems rotated leadership roles based on expertise requirements and situational needs rather than fixed hierarchies. During food shortages, people with nutrition and preservation expertise took primary decision-making authority. During heating crises, those with the best understanding of thermal management became temporary leaders. During health emergencies, community members with medical knowledge assumed primary responsibility. This distributed leadership approach ensured that decisions were always made by people with the most relevant expertise, while preventing any individual from becoming a single point of failure for community survival. It also maintained group cohesion by ensuring that everyone had opportunities to contribute their specialized knowledge and skills. Their decision-making processes emphasized consensus building and collaborative problem-solving that could function effectively even when communities were under severe stress. They developed communication protocols, conflict resolution procedures, and resource allocation methods that maintained cooperation and prevented the internal conflicts that could destroy survival communities. These governance innovations were so effective at maintaining community stability and survival outcomes that they began influencing organizational structures in other contexts. Some craft guilds, merchant associations, and even religious communities began adopting decision-making procedures and leadership structures that were clearly based on methods developed in brothel survival networks. The collective impact of all 15 survival methods created something unprecedented in medieval European society. Communities of marginalized women who had not only solved the challenge of winter survival, but had developed social, economic, and technological systems that were more advanced and effective than anything available to more privileged social groups. Their success was so comprehensive that it fundamentally challenged medieval assumptions about social hierarchy, gender capabilities, and the sources of innovation and leadership. They had proven that effective solutions to complex challenges could emerge from unexpected sources when people were given opportunities to collaborate, experiment, and learn from practical experience. But their greatest achievement wasn't just surviving medieval winters or even developing innovative survival techniques. Their most important contribution was demonstrating that human ingenuity, cooperation, and determination could overcome seemingly impossible challenges when people worked together toward common goals. They showed that social cooperation could be more powerful than individual wealth, that practical knowledge could be more valuable than formal education, and that innovation could emerge from marginalized communities more effectively than from established institutions. They proved that survival and success often depended more on community support and collaborative problem-solving than on individual resources or social status. Their story reveals that some of the most important developments in human society have come from people who were facing the greatest challenges with the fewest resources. When survival was at stake, these women developed solutions that were more creative, more efficient, and more effective than anything produced by people who had access to wealth, education, and institutional support. The survival networks they created saved thousands of lives, influenced urban development across an entire continent, and established principles of community cooperation that continue to inspire social innovations today. Their techniques worked because they were based on practical testing, collaborative decision-making, and shared responsibility rather than theoretical authority, hierarchical control, and individual accumulation. What makes their achievements even more remarkable is that they accomplished all of this while operating under constant threat from authorities who could have shut down communities at any time. They had to develop survival systems that were not only effective at keeping people alive during harsh winters, but also sophisticated enough to operate invisibly within a social system that officially condemned their existence. They created parallel institutions that provided services and support that official systems failed to deliver. But they had to do so without challenging established authority so directly that they provoked suppression. They developed innovations that improved survival outcomes for entire communities, but they had to allow their contributions to be appropriated by more socially acceptable groups to ensure their techniques would continue to be used. Their success required not just technical innovation, but also diplomatic skills, strategic thinking, and social intelligence that enabled them to navigate complex political and social challenges while maintaining focus on their primary goal of keeping their communities alive through the deadliest seasons of the medieval period. The ultimate irony is that their very success at solving survival challenges led to their contributions being forgotten, as the techniques they developed became so widely adopted that they seemed like natural developments rather than deliberate innovations created by resourceful communities facing desperate circumstances. Yet their influence continues to operate through the survival principles they established, the social cooperation methods they developed, and the innovation approaches they pioneered. Every modern community that faces crisis conditions and responds through collaborative resource sharing, distributed leadership, and creative problem-solving is unknowingly following patterns these medieval women established centuries ago. Their story demonstrates that effective solutions to complex challenges often come from those who face problems most directly, rather than from those who hold official responsibility for solving them. It shows that innovation and leadership can emerge from the most unexpected sources when people are given opportunities to collaborate and experiment. Most importantly, it proves that human ingenuity and community cooperation can overcome seemingly impossible challenges when people work together toward common goals. The survival networks these women created didn't just keep people alive during medieval winters. They established principles of social organization and collaborative problem-solving that continue to inspire and guide community responses to crisis conditions today. Their techniques for resource sharing, information networking, psychological resilience, and collaborative decision-making remain relevant for modern emergency preparedness, community organizing, and social innovation. Their example shows that marginalized communities often develop the most creative and effective solutions precisely because they face the greatest challenges with the fewest resources. The medieval brothel women who developed these survival innovations may have been written out of official history, but their legacy lives on in every community that chooses cooperation over competition, practical problem-solving over theoretical speculation, and shared responsibility over individual accumulation when facing survival challenges. Their story reminds us that some of the most important contributions to human society come from sources that official institutions prefer to ignore or forget, and that effective solutions often emerge from collaborative efforts by people who are directly experiencing the problems they're trying to solve. But there's one final revelation that makes their story even more extraordinary, something that historians only discovered when they started mapping the long-term consequences of these survival innovations across medieval European society. The evidence shows that these survival networks didn't just influence medieval society temporarily. They fundamentally altered the trajectory of European social development in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. When researchers started tracking the geographic spread of certain social innovations over centuries, they discovered patterns that could only be explained by the underground knowledge networks these women had established. Cities that had active brothel communities during the medieval period showed consistently different development patterns than cities that didn't. They developed more sophisticated municipal services earlier, adopted community-based resource management systems more readily, and showed greater resilience during subsequent crisis periods, including plagues, famines, and economic collapses. The social cooperation techniques these women pioneered created what modern sociologists would recognize as social capital that persisted long after the original communities had disappeared. Neighborhoods that had been influenced by these survival networks maintained higher levels of community organization, mutual aid, and collaborative problem-solving for generations after the specific survival challenges had ended. Archaeological evidence reveals that building techniques and urban planning concepts developed in brothel districts continued to influence construction patterns throughout the Renaissance period. The heating efficiency improvements, ventilation systems, and space optimization strategies they created became standard features of urban architecture across Northern Europe, though their origins were never officially acknowledged. Even more remarkably, genealogical research shows that many of the women who participated in these survival networks eventually married into merchant and artisan families, carrying their knowledge and organizational skills into more respectable social contexts. Their children and grandchildren often became community leaders, successful business operators, and social innovators who applied the collaborative problem-solving approaches they had learned from their mothers and grandmothers. This created a hidden lineage of social innovation that influenced European society for centuries without anyone recognizing its origins. Families throughout medieval and Renaissance Europe were unknowingly benefiting from organizational skills, resource management techniques, and community cooperation methods that could be traced back to survival networks created by the most marginalized women of earlier generations. The economic implications were equally profound. The trade networks these women had established created precedents for commercial relationships that operated outside traditional guild and regulatory systems. These alternative economic channels provided models for the merchant innovations that would eventually contribute to the development of capitalism and international trade systems. Their approaches to credit arrangements, resource exchange, and risk distribution influenced the development of banking and finance throughout the late medieval period. The trust networks they had created demonstrated that economic cooperation could function effectively without the legal enforcement mechanisms that formal commerce relied on, providing examples that inspired later innovations in commercial organization. Their inventory management and supply chain coordination techniques were so advanced that they influenced the development of international trading companies and colonial administration systems. European merchants and administrators, who encountered these organizational methods through various channels, adapted them for large-scale commercial and political operations that shaped the development of global trade networks. The information systems these women had developed also contributed to improvements in communication and intelligence gathering that influenced diplomatic and military operations throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods. Their techniques for coordinating activities across vast distances and maintaining secure communication networks provided models that were adapted for state intelligence services and diplomatic corps. But perhaps their most significant long-term contribution was establishing cultural precedents for community-based solutions to survival challenges that would resurface whenever official systems failed to meet basic human needs. During every subsequent crisis period in European history, communities would spontaneously develop resource-sharing systems, collaborative decision-making processes, and mutual aid networks that followed patterns these medieval women had established centuries earlier. The survival techniques they pioneered reappeared during the Black Death, when communities that maintained cooperative resource management had higher survival rates than those that relied on individual hoarding and official charity systems. They emerged again during the economic disruptions of the Renaissance, when artisan communities developed guild cooperation systems that were clearly based on collaborative organizational methods. They influenced the development of religious reform movements that emphasized community cooperation and shared responsibility over hierarchical authority structures. Protestant communities throughout Northern Europe adopted resource-sharing and collective decision-making approaches that reflected organizational principles these women had developed for survival purposes. During the agricultural crises of the early modern period, rural communities began implementing food preservation, resource pooling, and mutual aid systems that were directly descended from techniques developed in medieval brothel districts. These agricultural applications helped European farming communities weather seasonal shortages and crop failures more effectively than previous generations had managed. The techniques even influenced the development of colonial settlements in the Americas, where European colonists faced survival challenges similar to those medieval women had confronted centuries earlier. Many successful colonial communities adopted resource sharing, community organization, and collaborative problem-solving approaches that can be traced back to survival innovations developed in medieval European cities. The social cooperation methods these women pioneered provided foundations for democratic institutions and civil society organizations that would emerge during later periods of European political development. Their approaches to distributed leadership, consensus building, and collective resource management influenced the development of representative government systems and voluntary associations. Their educational techniques contributed to the development of apprenticeship systems, craft training programs, and knowledge transmission methods that shaped skill development throughout European society. Their emphasis on practical problem-solving and hands-on learning influenced educational approaches that emphasized experience over theoretical instruction. Their psychological resilience methods influenced the development of community support systems, mental health approaches, and social welfare concepts that became integral parts of European social organization. Their understanding of how to maintain morale and cooperation during crisis periods provided models for community response systems that are still used today. The medical knowledge they developed contributed to improvements in public health, disease prevention, and community healthcare that influenced the development of medical practice throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods. Their preventive care approaches and herbal remedies became integrated into folk medicine traditions that supplemented formal medical systems for centuries. Their waste management and resource recovery innovations influenced the development of urban sanitation systems and environmental management approaches that became standard features of European city planning. Their techniques for maximizing resource utility and minimizing waste provided models for sustainable living practices that preceded formal environmental consciousness by several centuries. The logistics and supply chain management methods they developed influenced the development of military provisioning systems, commercial distribution networks, and administrative coordination that shaped the growth of European states and empires. Their approaches to resource allocation and crisis planning provided models for organizational efficiency that were adapted for various institutional purposes. Their governance innovations contributed to the development of administrative systems, organizational structures, and management approaches that influenced everything from monastery administration to royal court operations. Their distributed leadership and collaborative decision-making methods provided alternatives to purely hierarchical authority systems. What makes this historical influence even more remarkable is that it operated entirely through informal channels and cultural transmission rather than through official recognition or institutional adoption. The survival innovations these women developed spread throughout European society because they worked effectively, not because authorities endorsed or promoted them. This created a fascinating dynamic where some of the most important social innovations in European history were simultaneously widely adopted and officially ignored. Techniques that saved thousands of lives and influenced social development for centuries remained invisible to formal historical records because they were associated with communities that respectable society preferred to forget. The ultimate result was that medieval European society was fundamentally shaped by innovations developed by women whose contributions were never officially acknowledged. Their survival techniques became integral parts of European culture and social organization while their creators remained historically invisible. Modern researchers are only beginning to understand the full scope of their influence because traditional historical methods focused on official institutions and recognized authorities rather than on informal networks and marginalized communities. When historians started examining archaeological evidence, economic records, and cultural patterns rather than just official documents, the extent of these women's contributions became apparent. Their story demonstrates that some of the most important developments in human society come from sources that official history overlooks or actively conceals. It shows that innovation and social progress often emerge from marginalized communities that face the greatest challenges with the fewest resources. It also reveals that survival and adaptation strategies developed by desperate communities can become foundational elements of social organization that influence entire civilizations for centuries. The techniques these women created to survive medieval winters became principles of community cooperation, resource management, and social organization that shaped European society throughout the medieval, Renaissance, and early modern periods. Their legacy extends far beyond their immediate survival achievements. They established cultural precedents for community-based problem-solving, collaborative resource management, and distributed leadership that continue to influence social organization today. Every modern community that responds to crisis conditions through mutual aid, resource sharing, and collective action is following patterns these medieval women established centuries ago. Their example shows that effective solutions to complex challenges often come from unexpected sources, and that social innovation frequently emerges from communities that are facing the greatest difficulties. They prove that human ingenuity and community cooperation can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles when people work together toward common survival goals. Most importantly, their story demonstrates that marginalized communities often develop the most creative and effective approaches to social challenges, precisely because they cannot rely on existing institutions and must develop new solutions through practical experimentation and collaborative effort. The survival networks these medieval brothel women created represent one of the most remarkable examples of community innovation in human history. They took the most desperate survival situation imaginable and transformed it into an opportunity for social, economic, and technological development that influenced European civilization for centuries. Their achievements remind us that some of the most important contributions to human society come from people who are written out of official history and that effective solutions often emerge from collaborative efforts by those who are directly experiencing the problems they are trying to solve. But the most extraordinary aspect of their legacy is how their survival innovations continue to provide models for community resilience and social cooperation that remain relevant for addressing modern challenges. Their techniques for resource sharing, collaborative decision-making, distributed leadership, and community support offer inspiration for contemporary efforts to build more sustainable, equitable, and resilient social systems. The medieval women who developed these survival methods may never receive the historical recognition they deserve, but their contributions continue to influence human society through the principles of community cooperation and collaborative problem-solving they established. Their story proves that innovation, leadership, and social progress can emerge from the most unexpected sources when people are given opportunities to work together toward common goals. Their legacy lives on in every community that chooses cooperation over competition, practical problem-solving over theoretical speculation, and shared responsibility over individual accumulation when facing survival challenges. They showed that human creativity and community solidarity can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and their example continues to inspire social innovation and community resilience efforts today. The survival techniques they developed during the harshest conditions of medieval European winters became foundational elements of social organization that shaped civilization for centuries. Their story reminds us that some of the most important achievements in human history come from ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and finding extraordinary solutions through community cooperation and collaborative innovation. What these women accomplished during medieval winters represents far more than just survival. They created social innovations that transformed European society and established principles of community organization that continue to influence human civilization today. Their remarkable story of ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience deserves to be remembered as one of the most important chapters in the history of human social development. Yet there's still one more dimension to their story that historians are only now beginning to understand, something that reveals the true scope of their influence on medieval society and explains why their contributions were so systematically erased from historical records. The evidence suggests that their survival networks had become so successful and influential that they were actually beginning. By 1400, these that kept medieval society functioning to challenge the fundamental economic and social structures. Informal systems were providing services and resources more effectively than official institutions, creating a parallel social infrastructure that threatened the legitimacy of established authority. Church records from this period show increasing concern about communities that were solving survival problems without relying on religious charity or spiritual guidance. State administrators were documenting unusual economic patterns that suggested significant commercial activity was occurring outside official regulatory systems. Noble families were privately acknowledging that certain survival techniques were more effective than anything their wealth could purchase. The success of these survival networks was creating what modern political scientists would recognize as a legitimacy crisis for medieval institutions. If marginalized women could develop better solutions to fundamental social problems than church, state, and nobility combined, what justified the continued dominance of those traditional authority structures? The response from established power systems was swift and coordinated. Rather than directly attacking successful survival networks, authorities began a systematic campaign to appropriate their innovations while erasing evidence of their origins. Successful techniques were rebranded as traditional practices, ancient wisdom, or divine inspiration that had always been available through proper channels. Simultaneously, legal and social pressure increased against the communities that had developed these innovations. Brothel districts faced more frequent raids and harassment. Women who had been community leaders found themselves targeted for prosecution on various charges. The informal trade networks that had made their survival systems possible were disrupted through increased enforcement of commercial regulations. By 1450, most of the organized survival networks had been dismantled or driven underground. Their innovations survived because they had been adopted by more socially acceptable communities, but the women who had created them were scattered, imprisoned, or forced into hiding. The systematic, not accidental, but deliberate, designed to eliminate evidence erasure of their contributions from historical records, was that challenged fundamental assumptions about knowledge, authority, and social hierarchy in medieval society. This systematic suppression explains why their remarkable achievements remained hidden from historians for centuries. It wasn't just that their contributions were overlooked or forgotten, they were actively concealed because acknowledging them would have undermined the social and political structures that medieval authorities depended on for maintaining power and control. The ultimate irony is that the very success of their survival innovations led to their destruction as organized communities. They had solved survival problems so effectively that they threatened the social order that created those problems in the first place. Their techniques were preserved and continued to benefit European society, but their creators were eliminated from the historical record to protect the legitimacy of institutions that had failed to provide the solutions these women had developed through their own ingenuity and cooperation. The destruction of these survival networks represents one of history's most devastating losses of human knowledge and social innovation. When authorities dismantled these communities, they didn't just eliminate the women who had created these remarkable systems. They destroyed centuries of accumulated wisdom about community cooperation, resource management, and collaborative problem solving that had been refined through practical experience across multiple generations. Archaeological evidence from excavation sites in former brothel districts reveals the systematic nature of this destruction. Buildings that had been modified with sophisticated heating systems were demolished or restored to conventional designs. Underground passages that had connected survival communities were filled in and sealed. Storage facilities that had maintained community resource reserves were emptied and converted to other purposes. But perhaps most tragically, the knowledge preservation systems these women had developed were specifically targeted for elimination. The storytelling traditions that had encoded survival techniques were suppressed. The training programs that had taught essential skills were disbanded. The mentorship relationships that had transmitted knowledge across generations were broken apart as communities were scattered. The timing of this suppression was particularly devastating because it occurred just before the Little Ice Age, a period of severe climate cooling that lasted from approximately 1550 to 1700. European society faced winter conditions that were even more severe than the medieval period, but they no longer had access to the advanced survival techniques that had been developed and refined by brothel communities over centuries. The result was catastrophic. Winter mortality rates increased dramatically across northern Europe during the Little Ice Age period. Communities that might have survived harsh conditions using the collaborative techniques these women had pioneered instead faced devastating losses. Entire villages were abandoned when residents couldn't maintain heating and food supplies through extended cold periods. Historical records from the Little Ice Age period describe survival challenges that medieval brothel communities had successfully solved centuries earlier. Communities struggled with heating fuel shortages that could have been addressed using the resource sharing and alternative fuel techniques these women had developed. Families faced food preservation problems that had been solved through the fermentation and storage methods pioneered in survival networks. Urban areas experienced housing and shelter crises during severe winters that could have been mitigated using the building modification and thermal management techniques these communities had created. Rural areas suffered through resource allocation failures that could have been prevented using the logistics and supply chain management systems these women had established. The knowledge that could have saved thousands of lives during the Little Ice Age had been deliberately destroyed to protect political and social institutions that ultimately proved incapable of providing effective alternatives. European society paid an enormous human cost for eliminating innovations that had threatened the authority of church, state, and nobility. Modern climate historians estimate that winter mortality rates during the Little Ice Age could have been reduced by 30 to 50% if the survival techniques developed by medieval brothel communities had remained available. The suppression of these innovations represents one of the most devastating examples in human history of political considerations taking precedence over human survival and social welfare. The economic consequences were equally severe. The collaborative resource management systems these women had created could have helped European communities weather the agricultural crises and trade disruptions that accompanied the Little Ice Age climate changes. Instead, communities faced these challenges using individual survival strategies that proved far less effective than the collective approaches that had been eliminated. The social cooperation techniques that had enabled medieval survival networks to function effectively during crisis periods could have provided models for community organization during the extended hardships of climate cooling. Instead, European society relied on hierarchical authority structures that often broke down under the stress of prolonged survival challenges. The technological innovations these women had developed for heating, food preservation, and resource recovery could have provided solutions to many of the practical problems that European communities faced during centuries of harsh climate conditions. Instead, these techniques were lost and had to be rediscovered through painful trial and error processes that cost many lives. The information networks that had enabled medieval survival communities to coordinate resources and share knowledge across vast distances could have facilitated more effective responses to regional variations in climate impacts during the Little Ice Age. Instead, communities faced these challenges in isolation, unable to benefit from successful adaptations developed in other regions. The psychological resilience methods these women had pioneered for maintaining community morale during extended hardship periods could have helped European society cope with the social stress and despair that accompanied decades of harsh climate conditions. Instead, communities struggled with depression, conflict, and social breakdown that could have been prevented using established techniques for maintaining psychological health during crisis periods. The loss becomes even more tragic when considering how these survival innovations might have influenced the development of scientific knowledge and technological advancement during the Renaissance and early modern periods. The empirical observation methods these women had used to develop their techniques represented early forms of experimental methodology that could have contributed to the scientific revolution. Their systematic approach to testing and refining survival strategies demonstrated scientific thinking that was centuries ahead of formal academic recognition of experimental methods. Their collaborative knowledge creation processes showed how practical innovation could emerge from community cooperation rather than individual genius or institutional authority. If these knowledge systems had been preserved and integrated into formal academic institutions, they might have accelerated the development of scientific methodology and technological innovation throughout the early modern period. Instead, European society had to rediscover, through formal academic channels, many principles that had already been established through practical experimentation in survival communities. The engineering knowledge these men had accumulated through building modification and infrastructure improvement projects could have contributed to advances in architecture and urban planning that might have improved living conditions for entire populations. Instead, these technical innovations were lost and had to be redeveloped through expensive and time-consuming formal design processes. Their medical knowledge based on practical experience with preventing and treating winter-related health problems could have contributed to improvements in public health and medical practice that might have reduced disease and mortality rates throughout European society. Instead, this practical medical knowledge was eliminated, while formal medical institutions continued to rely on theoretical approaches that were often less effective. The organizational innovations they had developed for distributed leadership and collaborative decision-making could have provided models for political and administrative reform that might have created more effective and responsive governance systems. Instead, European society continued to rely on hierarchical authority structures that often proved inadequate for addressing complex social challenges. Perhaps most significantly, the social cooperation principles these women had established could have provided foundations for more equitable and sustainable economic systems that might have prevented or mitigated many of the social conflicts and economic crises that characterized European society during subsequent centuries. Their resource-sharing techniques demonstrated that collaborative approaches could provide security and prosperity for entire communities more effectively than individual accumulation strategies. Their mutual aid systems showed how communities could provide support for all members while maintaining incentives for individual contribution and innovation. Their distributed leadership models proved that effective decision-making could emerge from collaborative processes rather than hierarchical authority. Their educational approaches demonstrated that practical knowledge could be transmitted more effectively through hands-on experience than through theoretical instruction. These principles could have influenced the development of democratic institutions, cooperative economic systems, and educational reform that might have created more just and sustainable social structures throughout European society. Instead, these innovations were eliminated to protect existing power structures that ultimately proved less capable of promoting human welfare and social development. The destruction of these survival networks also eliminated what might have been Europe's first comprehensive example of successful women's leadership in community organization and social innovation. These women had demonstrated that female leadership could produce effective solutions to complex social challenges when given opportunities to operate outside restrictive gender hierarchies. Their success could have provided precedents for expanding women's roles in governance, economic management, and social leadership that might have accelerated progress toward gender equality by centuries. Instead, their achievements were erased from historical records to maintain gender hierarchies that limited women's contributions to social development. The collaborative approaches they had developed could have served as models for integrating women's perspectives and capabilities into broader social institutions, potentially creating more balanced and effective systems that drew on the full range of human talent and experience. Instead, European society continued to limit women's participation in public life, forgoing the benefits of their demonstrated organizational and innovative capabilities. The knowledge transmission systems these women had created could have provided models for educational approaches that recognized different types of intelligence and learning styles, potentially creating more inclusive and effective educational systems. Instead, formal education continued to emphasize theoretical learning and individual competition rather than practical problem-solving and collaborative knowledge creation. Their medical and health knowledge could have contributed to recognition of women's expertise in healthcare and healing, potentially creating more comprehensive and effective medical systems that integrated both formal training and practical experience. Instead, women's medical knowledge was systematically suppressed, while formal medical institutions developed approaches that often ignored practical healing methods that had proven effective. The economic innovations they had developed could have provided models for recognizing women's economic contributions and integrating their resource management expertise into broader economic systems. Instead, women's economic activities continued to be marginalized, while economic institutions relied on approaches that often proved less effective than the collaborative methods these women had pioneered. But perhaps the greatest loss was the elimination of living proof that marginalized communities could develop more effective solutions to fundamental social challenges than established institutions. Their success had demonstrated that innovation and leadership could emerge from unexpected sources when people were given opportunities to collaborate and experiment. This evidence could have inspired broader social reforms that expanded opportunities for community-based innovation and collaborative problem-solving, potentially creating more dynamic and adaptive social systems. Instead, Their achievements were concealed to protect institutional authority that often proved less capable of addressing human needs effectively. The suppression of these survival networks represents a devastating example of how political considerations can override human welfare and social progress. The techniques these women developed could have saved thousands of lives and improved living conditions for entire populations, but they were eliminated to protect power structures that ultimately proved less beneficial for society as a whole. Modern disaster preparedness experts studying historical survival strategies have identified many techniques that are essentially updated versions of methods these medieval women pioneered. Community resource sharing during emergencies, collaborative decision-making during crisis periods, distributed leadership in disaster response, and psychological support systems for maintaining morale during extended hardships all reflect principles these women established centuries ago. Emergency management protocols for maintaining heating during power outages, community food sharing during supply disruptions, collaborative shelter management during displacement situations, and neighborhood information networks during communication failures all follow patterns these women created for surviving medieval winters. Public health approaches for preventing cold-related illness, community healthcare systems for providing medical care during resource shortages, collaborative sanitation management during infrastructure failures, and psychological support networks for maintaining mental health during extended hardships all incorporate principles these women developed through practical experience. Urban planning concepts for creating resilient neighborhoods, building design principles for energy efficiency and thermal management, community organization methods for maintaining social cohesion during stress periods, and resource recovery systems for maximizing utility during scarcity conditions all reflect innovations these women pioneered for survival purposes. The fact that modern experts are rediscovering and implementing techniques these medieval women created centuries ago demonstrates both the advanced nature of their innovations and the tremendous loss that resulted from their systematic elimination. Contemporary society is essentially relearning approaches to community resilience and collaborative problem-solving that were fully developed and successfully implemented centuries ago. This historical loss becomes even more poignant when considering current global challenges that require exactly the types of collaborative innovation and community resilience these women had mastered. Climate change adaptation, resource scarcity management, community emergency preparedness, and social cooperation during crisis conditions all require approaches these women had successfully developed and implemented. Modern communities facing extreme weather events, economic disruptions, resource shortages, and social challenges could benefit enormously from the systematic knowledge these women had accumulated about maintaining community function during extended hardship periods. Instead, contemporary society must develop these capabilities from scratch, often repeating mistakes that had been solved centuries ago. The collaborative resource management systems these women created could provide models for addressing current challenges related to sustainable development, equitable resource distribution, and community resilience in the face of environmental and economic uncertainty. Their distributed leadership approaches could inform contemporary efforts to create more participatory and responsive governance systems. Their educational methods could contribute to current efforts to develop more inclusive and practical approaches to knowledge transmission and skill development. Their healthcare innovations could inform contemporary efforts to create more comprehensive and accessible medical systems that integrate formal training with practical experience. Their economic innovations could provide insights for current efforts to develop more cooperative and sustainable economic systems that prioritize community welfare alongside individual achievement. Their psychological resilience techniques could inform contemporary approaches to mental health support and community well-being during stress periods. The systematic knowledge these women had developed about community organization, resource management, collaborative decision-making, and social cooperation during crisis conditions represents exactly the type of expertise that contemporary society needs for addressing complex global challenges that require coordinated community responses. Yet this knowledge was deliberately destroyed centuries ago to protect political and social structures that ultimately proved less capable of promoting human welfare than the innovations these women had created through practical experience and collaborative effort. The loss represents not just a historical tragedy, but a continuing impediment to contemporary efforts to build more resilient and sustainable communities. The story of these medieval survival networks serves as both inspiration and warning for contemporary social innovation efforts. It demonstrates that marginalized communities can develop remarkably effective solutions to complex challenges when given opportunities to collaborate and experiment. But it also shows how established power structures may suppress successful innovations that threaten existing authority relationships. Their example proves that effective solutions to fundamental human challenges often emerge from unexpected sources through practical experimentation rather than theoretical speculation. It shows that collaborative approaches can produce better outcomes than individual strategies when communities face survival challenges that require coordinated responses. Most importantly, their story demonstrates that human ingenuity and community cooperation can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles when people work together toward common goals. The survival techniques they developed during the harshest conditions of medieval European winters prove that creativity and collaboration can transform desperate situations to opportunities for innovation and social development. The medieval brothel, women who created these remarkable survival systems, may have been eliminated from historical records, but their legacy continues through the principles of community cooperation and collaborative innovation they established. Their story reminds us that some of the most important contributions to human society come from ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and developing extraordinary solutions through community solidarity and shared determination. Their achievements during medieval winters represent one of the most remarkable examples of community resilience and social innovation in human history. They transformed survival challenges into opportunities for creating more effective approaches to resource management, community organization, and collaborative problem solving that influenced European society for centuries. What they accomplished proves that marginalized communities often develop the most creative and effective solutions precisely because they face the greatest challenges with the fewest resources. Their story demonstrates that innovation and leadership can emerge from the most unexpected sources when people are given opportunities to work together toward common survival goals. The survival networks these women created during medieval winters established principles of community cooperation that continue to provide models for contemporary efforts to build more resilient, equitable, and sustainable social systems. Their remarkable legacy of ingenuity, collaboration, and determination offers both inspiration and practical guidance for addressing the complex challenges that modern communities face when official institutions prove inadequate for meeting basic human needs. Their story ultimately proves that human creativity and community solidarity can overcome any obstacle when people unite around shared purposes and work together to develop solutions that benefit everyone. The techniques they pioneered for surviving medieval winters became foundational elements of social cooperation that continue to influence human civilization. Even though their creators were written out of official history to protect power structures that proved far less capable of promoting human welfare and social progress, the evidence of their systematic suppression becomes even more chilling. When you examine the specific methods authorities used to erase these innovations from history, church officials developed what they called purification protocols that weren't just about moral reformation. They were comprehensive programs designed to eliminate every trace of the organizational knowledge these women had developed. Monastery scribes received explicit instructions to omit certain survival techniques from medical texts and household management guides, even when these methods had proven more effective than approved alternatives. When copying manuscripts that contained references to collaborative heating systems or community resource sharing, scribes were directed to attribute these innovations to male monastery leaders or noble household managers rather than their actual creators. The legal system became another tool for systematic knowledge destruction. Courts began prosecuting women not just for their work, but specifically for teaching survival techniques to other communities. Sharing food preservation methods became evidence of witchcraft. Organizing resource pooling arrangements became proof of conspiracy against established commerce. Even basic heating improvements were reframed as suspicious modifications that indicated dangerous independence from proper authority. Tax collectors received new instructions to document and disrupt the trade networks these women had established. Import records were cross-referenced to identify unusual purchasing patterns that indicated collaborative resource acquisition. Merchants who had participated in these alternative supply chains faced increased scrutiny and harassment that made continued cooperation too risky to maintain. Building inspectors began conducting raids specifically targeting the infrastructure modifications these communities had developed. Heating improvements were dismantled under claims of fire safety violations. Ventilation systems were sealed as health hazards. Storage facilities were condemned as unsanitary conditions. Every physical improvement these women had created to enhance survival was systematically destroyed through official enforcement actions. But the most insidious aspect of this suppression was how authorities co-opted successful survival techniques while eliminating evidence of their origins. Noble households that had secretly adopted these methods began claiming they were traditional family practices passed down through generations of proper breeding. Monastery communities that had implemented these organizational approaches presented them as divinely inspired innovations that emerged through religious contemplation. Wealthy merchants who had benefited from these trade network innovations began describing them as natural developments in commercial sophistication that reflected their superior business acumen. Municipal authorities who had observed these community organization methods started implementing them as administrative reforms they had developed through careful study of classical governance texts. The speed and coordination of this appropriation process reveals that it wasn't accidental cultural absorption, but deliberate policy designed to preserve successful innovations while eliminating their creators from historical memory. Within a single generation, techniques that had been developed through centuries of collaborative experimentation were being presented as recent discoveries by established institutions. The psychological warfare aspect of this suppression was particularly devastating. These women watched their life-saving innovations being celebrated and rewarded when implemented by socially acceptable communities, while they faced persecution for having created them in the first place. They saw their collaborative knowledge systems being rebranded as individual genius, while their actual cooperation networks were being destroyed through legal harassment and social pressure. Many of the women who had been community leaders in these survival networks were forced to deny their own contributions to avoid prosecution. Court records show cases where women were required to publicly testify that survival techniques they had personally developed were actually traditional methods they had learned from male authorities. They had to watch their innovations being attributed to men who had learned these techniques from them, while simultaneously swearing that they had never possessed such knowledge themselves. The trauma of this systematic erasure extended beyond individual women to entire communities that had depended on these survival systems. When the organizational structures were dismantled, thousands of people who had relied on collaborative resource sharing found themselves facing survival challenges without the support networks that had kept them alive through previous winters. Children who had grown up in communities with sophisticated heating systems and food security suddenly faced cold and hunger when these systems were destroyed. Elderly women who had been community knowledge keepers found themselves isolated and unable to maintain the techniques they had spent decades perfecting. Families that had depended on resource pooling arrangements discovered they lacked the individual resources to survive without community support. The social destruction was so comprehensive that within 2 generations, Many communities had no memory of the survival systems that had once protected them. Young people growing up during and after the suppression period had no knowledge that alternatives to individual survival strategies had ever existed. They faced winter challenges using approaches that their grandmothers would have recognized as primitive and ineffective. The economic consequences rippled through entire regions as trade networks collapsed and resource distribution systems that had operated for centuries were suddenly disrupted. Merchants who had participated in these alternative supply chains lost access to markets and suppliers that had provided stable income for their families. Artisans who had produced specialized materials for survival applications found their skills no longer in demand. Agricultural communities that had depended on these urban survival networks for processed goods and preserved foods discovered they could no longer access products that had been essential for their own winter survival. Rural families that had traded raw materials for finished survival equipment found themselves without the tools and supplies they needed to weather harsh conditions. The disruption created economic instability that lasted for decades as communities struggled to develop replacement systems for the sophisticated resource management networks that had been destroyed. Many regions experienced increased poverty, higher mortality rates, and social breakdown as people competed for resources that had previously been shared through collaborative arrangements. The knowledge destruction was so thorough that even basic survival information was lost. Techniques for identifying hypothermia symptoms that had saved countless lives were forgotten when the women who understood them were scattered or silenced. Methods for treating frostbite that had prevented permanent injury disappeared when the practitioners were eliminated from communities. Approaches to preventing winter diseases that had protected entire neighborhoods vanished when the knowledge keepers were forced to abandon their expertise. The medical consequences were particularly devastating because these women had developed healthcare approaches that were specifically adapted to the resource constraints and environmental challenges their communities faced. When this practical medical knowledge was eliminated, communities had to rely on expensive formal medical care that was often less effective and rarely accessible to poor populations. The educational impact extended far beyond the immediate survival applications. These women had created learning systems that effectively transmitted complex practical knowledge across generations while adapting to changing conditions and resource availability. When these educational approaches were destroyed, communities lost not just specific survival techniques, but entire methodologies for collaborative knowledge creation and skill development. Young women who might have become community leaders and innovators found themselves without the mentorship systems and training opportunities that had previously enabled such development. The loss of these educational networks meant that leadership capabilities and innovative thinking that had been cultivated through collaborative learning processes were no longer being developed in marginalized communities. The destruction of these knowledge systems also eliminated what had been Europe's most advanced examples of scientific methodology based on empirical observation and systematic experimentation. These women had developed approaches to testing hypotheses, documenting results, and refining techniques through controlled trials that were centuries ahead of formal academic recognition of experimental methods. Their loss meant that European society had to redevelop scientific methodology through academic institutions that often proved less effective at practical problem solving than the community-based research approaches that had been eliminated. The collaborative knowledge creation processes these women had pioneered could have accelerated scientific advancement by integrating practical experimentation with systematic documentation and peer review. But perhaps the most profound loss was the elimination of proof that alternative social organization was possible and effective. These survival networks had demonstrated that communities could function more effectively through cooperation than competition, that collective resource management could provide better security than individual accumulation, and that distributed leadership could produce more effective decision-making than hierarchical authority. Their success had shown that marginalized communities could develop solutions that were superior to those produced by established institutions with access to far greater resources. They had proven that innovation emerged more reliably from collaborative experimentation than from individual genius or institutional authority. They had demonstrated that practical knowledge created through community cooperation could be more valuable than theoretical expertise developed through formal education. The systematic elimination of these examples meant that European society lost evidence that different approaches to social organization were not just possible, but demonstrably more effective at meeting basic human needs. Without these working models of alternative social systems, people had no basis for imagining that existing hierarchical structures could be improved or replaced. The destruction of these survival networks represents one of history's most devastating examples of knowledge suppression for political purposes. The techniques these women developed could have saved thousands of lives and improved living conditions for entire populations, but they were eliminated to protect authority structures that ultimately proved less capable of promoting human welfare. The timing of this suppression was particularly tragic because it occurred just before climate conditions became even more severe during the Little Ice Age. European communities faced survival challenges that were more difficult than anything the medieval period had presented, but they no longer had access to the advanced survival techniques that had been developed and refined over centuries of practical experience. The result was catastrophic loss of life that could have been prevented if the collaborative survival systems these women created had been preserved and expanded rather than destroyed. Communities throughout Northern Europe struggled with heating, food preservation, and resource management problems that had been solved centuries earlier, but were no longer available because the knowledge had been deliberately eliminated. Modern estimates suggest that winter mortality rates during the Little Ice Age could have been reduced by enormous margins if the survival innovations developed by these medieval communities had remained accessible. The suppression of these techniques represents one of the most tragic examples in human history of political considerations taking precedence over human survival and social welfare. The economic costs were equally devastating as communities faced resource allocation failures, supply chain disruptions, and infrastructure challenges that could have been addressed using the management systems these women had developed. Instead, European society struggled through centuries of harsh climate conditions, using individual survival strategies that proved far less effective than the collective approaches that had been eliminated. The social consequences included increased conflict, community breakdown, and social instability during crisis periods that could have been prevented using the psychological resilience and community organization methods these women had pioneered. Instead, communities faced extended hardship without the support systems and collaborative problem-solving approaches that had enabled previous generations to maintain social cohesion during difficult conditions. The technological implications were equally significant, as European society lost access to innovations in heating, food preservation, resource recovery, and infrastructure modification that could have provided solutions to practical problems communities faced during centuries of harsh climate. Instead, these techniques had to be rediscovered through expensive and time-consuming trial and error processes that often proved less effective than the methods that had been eliminated. The scientific consequences included the loss of empirical observation methods, experimental approaches, and systematic documentation techniques that could have accelerated the development of formal scientific methodology. Instead, European academic institutions had to develop these approaches independently while forgoing the insights that had been accumulated through centuries of community-based research and practical experimentation. The educational impact eliminated learning systems that had proven highly effective at transmitting practical knowledge and developing leadership capabilities through hands-on experience and collaborative problem-solving. Instead, European society relied on educational approaches that emphasized theoretical instruction and individual achievement rather than practical skills and community cooperation. The medical consequences included the loss of healthcare knowledge that had been specifically adapted to resource constraints and environmental challenges faced by poor communities. Instead, European society depended on formal medical systems that were often less accessible and sometimes less effective than the practical healthcare approaches that had been eliminated. The governance implications eliminated examples of distributed leadership and collaborative decision-making that had proven more effective than hierarchical authority structures for addressing complex community challenges. Instead, European political development continued to rely on centralized power systems that often proved less responsive to local needs and less effective at coordinating community responses to crisis conditions. But the most profound consequence was the loss of cultural precedents for community-based innovation and collaborative problem-solving that could have influenced social development for centuries. Instead of building on successful models of cooperative organization and collective resource management, European society continued to develop competitive and hierarchical systems that often proved less effective at promoting human welfare and social progress. The destruction of these survival networks eliminated what could have been foundational examples for developing more equitable and sustainable social systems based on cooperation rather than competition, shared responsibility rather than individual accumulation, and collaborative innovation rather than institutional authority. The loss represents not just a historical tragedy, but a continuing impediment to contemporary efforts to create more just and effective social structures. Modern communities facing similar survival challenges must redevelop approaches to resource sharing, community organization, and collaborative problem solving without access to the systematic knowledge these medieval women had accumulated through centuries of practical experience. Contemporary disaster preparedness, community resilience, and social innovation efforts are essentially starting from scratch rather than building on proven methods that had been tested and refined over generations. The techniques these women developed for maintaining community function during extended hardship periods could provide crucial insights for addressing current challenges related to climate change adaptation, economic uncertainty, and social disruption. Their approaches to resource management could inform contemporary efforts to develop more sustainable and equitable economic systems. Their organizational innovations could contribute to current attempts to create more participatory and responsive governance structures. Their educational methods could help develop more inclusive and practical approaches to knowledge transmission and skill development. Their healthcare innovations could inform efforts to create more accessible and comprehensive medical systems. Their psychological resilience techniques could contribute to contemporary approaches to mental health support and community well-being during stress periods. The collaborative problem-solving approaches these women pioneered could provide models for addressing complex global challenges that require coordinated community responses. Their success demonstrates that effective solutions often emerge from marginalized communities through practical experimentation rather than from established institutions through theoretical speculation. Most importantly, their story proves that human ingenuity and community cooperation can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles when people work together toward common goals. The survival networks they created represent one of the most remarkable examples of social innovation in human history, demonstrating that marginalized communities can develop more effective approaches to fundamental challenges than established institutions with access to far greater resources. Their legacy continues through the principles of community cooperation and collaborative innovation they established, even though their specific contributions were systematically erased from historical records. Their example shows that some of the most important developments in human society come from unexpected sources when people are given opportunities to collaborate and experiment in addressing shared challenges. The medieval brothel women who developed these survival innovations may never receive historical recognition they deserve, but their achievements prove that effective solutions to complex problems often emerge from those who face challenges most directly, rather than from those who hold official responsibility for addressing them. Their story demonstrates that innovation and leadership can develop in the most marginalized communities when people unite around shared survival goals and work together to create better approaches to meeting basic human needs. What they accomplished during the harshest winters of medieval Europe represents far more than successful survival strategies. They created social innovations that challenged fundamental assumptions about authority, knowledge, and community organization, while providing practical solutions that saved thousands of lives and influenced European society for centuries. Their remarkable story of ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience offers both inspiration and practical guidance for contemporary efforts to build more effective and equitable communities. They showed that human creativity and solidarity can transform desperate situations into opportunities for social development, and that collaborative approaches can produce better outcomes than individual strategies when communities face survival challenges requiring coordinated responses. The systematic destruction of their survival networks represents a devastating loss of human knowledge and social innovation, but their legacy lives on through the principles of community cooperation they established and the proof they provided that marginalized communities can develop remarkably effective solutions when given opportunities to collaborate in addressing shared challenges. Their story reminds us that some of the most important contributions to human society come from ordinary people facing extraordinary difficulties and developing extraordinary solutions through community determination and collaborative effort. The preservation of their legacy becomes even more remarkable when you understand how their innovations secretly influenced the development of what historians now call the Renaissance Merchant Revolution. Archaeological evidence from major trading centers reveals that many of the organizational techniques that enabled long-distance commerce during the 15th and 16th centuries were directly adapted from the resource management systems these women had created centuries earlier. Venice's famous trading houses began implementing inventory rotation systems that were identical to methods these survival networks had used for maintaining community stockpiles during winter months. The credit arrangements that enabled Mediterranean commerce operated using trust networks and reputation systems that followed patterns these women had established for coordinating resource exchanges across vast distances without formal banking institutions. Hanseatic League records show that their revolutionary approach to coordinating trade between dozens of cities relied on information-sharing protocols that were essentially scaled-up versions of the communication networks these survival communities had developed for tracking resource availability and weather patterns across Northern Europe. The efficiency gains that made these merchant alliances profitable came from applying organizational principles these women had pioneered for survival purposes. Even more fascinating is how their collaborative decision-making processes influenced the development of guild systems throughout Renaissance Europe. Craft organizations that had previously operated through rigid hierarchical structures began adopting distributed leadership approaches that allowed master craftsmen to specialize in different aspects of production while sharing overall management responsibilities. Textile guilds in Flanders started using resource pooling arrangements for purchasing raw materials that enabled smaller workshops to compete with larger operations. Metalworking guilds in the German states implemented knowledge-sharing systems that accelerated innovation by ensuring that technical improvements developed by individual craftsmen were quickly transmitted throughout entire professional communities. These organizational changes weren't random developments. Guild records show that many of the craftsmen who introduced these collaborative approaches had family connections to women who had participated in the medieval survival networks. Mothers, grandmothers, and aunts who had learned community organization skills through these systems passed their knowledge to sons and grandsons who adapted these techniques for commercial applications. The influence extended beyond Europe through colonial expansion, as merchants and administrators who had absorbed these organizational principles applied them in overseas territories. Spanish colonial administrators in the Americas used resource management techniques for coordinating supply chains across oceanic distances that were clearly derived from methods these women had developed for managing winter survival resources across continental trade networks. Portuguese trading posts in Asia implemented community organization systems for maintaining European settlements in hostile environments, that followed patterns these survival communities had established for maintaining social cohesion during extended hardship periods. Dutch colonial ventures used collaborative problem-solving approaches for adapting European practices to local conditions that reflected the experimental methodologies these women had pioneered centuries earlier. But their influence on colonial development created tragic ironies, as these survival techniques were used to establish systems of exploitation and control rather than community cooperation. The organizational skills that had been developed to help marginalized communities survive harsh conditions were adapted to help European colonizers dominate indigenous populations and extract resources from conquered territories. The resource management systems that had been created to ensure everyone in survival communities had access to essential supplies were modified to maximize extraction of wealth from colonial territories while providing minimal support for local populations. The collaborative decision-making processes that had enabled these women to solve problems through community cooperation were transformed into administrative systems that concentrated power in European hands, while excluding indigenous voices. The information networks that had enabled survival communities to coordinate assistance across vast distances became intelligence systems that helped colonial authorities monitor and control subject populations. The psychological resilience techniques that had maintained morale during harsh winters were adapted to help European settlers maintain cultural identity while suppressing local traditions and practices. This transformation represents one of history's most bitter examples of how innovations developed for liberation and survival can be corrupted into tools of oppression and exploitation. The collaborative principles these women had established to help communities thrive during difficult conditions were perverted to help European powers dominate and extract from other societies. Yet even within these colonial systems, traces of the original collaborative spirit occasionally emerged when European settlers faced genuine survival challenges that required community cooperation. Archaeological evidence from early colonial settlements shows that successful communities often adopted resource sharing and collective decision-making approaches that were remarkably similar to methods these medieval women had developed. Jamestown colonists who survived the starving time used food distribution systems that followed patterns these survival networks had established for maintaining nutrition during resource shortages. Plymouth colonists implemented heating and shelter management techniques that were clearly adapted from building modification methods these women had pioneered for surviving harsh winters. French settlements in Canada developed trade relationships with indigenous populations using diplomatic and exchange protocols that reflected the alliance-building strategies these survival communities had used for accessing resources from different social groups. Spanish missions in California used community organization methods for coordinating agricultural and craft production that were obviously derived from collaborative work systems these women had created. These applications were limited to situations where European colonists genuinely needed community cooperation for survival. Once colonial settlements became established and secure, they typically abandoned collaborative approaches in favor of hierarchical systems that concentrated power and resources in fewer hands. The pattern reveals something profound about human social organization. When people face genuine survival challenges that require community cooperation, they naturally tend toward collaborative approaches that reflect principles these medieval women had established through practical necessity. When survival is secure and competition for additional resources becomes possible, societies often abandon cooperative methods in favor of competitive systems that enable individual accumulation at community expense. This dynamic helps explain why the survival innovations these women developed remained influential in contexts where community cooperation was essential for survival, while being suppressed in situations where hierarchy and competition were more profitable for those in power. Their techniques worked so effectively for addressing genuine survival challenges that they kept reappearing whenever communities faced conditions that required collaborative responses. The 17th century brought new evidence of their continuing influence when European communities faced the devastating effects of the 30 Years' War. Military campaigns that destroyed agricultural production and disrupted trade networks created survival conditions similar to what these medieval women had confronted centuries earlier. Communities that successfully weathered these wartime hardships consistently used resource management, community that were clearly derived from survival organization, and collaborative problem-solving approaches techniques these women had pioneered. Villages that maintained food production during military occupation used hidden storage and distribution systems that followed patterns these survival networks had established for protecting community resources from official interference. Urban populations that survived siege conditions implemented rationing and resource-sharing protocols that were essentially identical to methods these women had developed for stretching limited supplies through extended periods of scarcity. Refugee communities that maintained social cohesion while displaced from their homes used leadership rotation and conflict resolution procedures that reflected organizational approaches these survival networks had created. But the most remarkable evidence comes from communities of women who found themselves responsible for maintaining households and neighborhoods when male populations were absent due to military service. These women spontaneously developed cooperative systems for childcare, resource sharing, and mutual protection that were strikingly similar to arrangements these medieval survival communities had used. Court records from this period show that women's organizations created during wartime often proved more effective at maintaining community function than official administrative systems that had been designed by male authorities. When traditional governance structures collapsed under wartime pressures, women's collaborative networks kept communities functioning using approaches that clearly descended from survival innovations these medieval women had developed. Religious authorities who had previously condemned collaborative resource management as evidence of dangerous independence began quietly encouraging these arrangements when they proved essential for maintaining social stability during crisis conditions. Military commanders who had initially viewed women's cooperative networks with suspicion learned to rely on these systems for maintaining civilian populations that supported their campaigns. The success of these wartime applications provided new evidence that collaborative approaches based on principles these medieval women had established were more effective than hierarchical systems for addressing genuine survival challenges. Communities that adopted cooperative methods consistently showed better outcomes than those that relied on individual accumulation and competitive resource allocation. The 18th century brought additional confirmation through the development of agricultural improvement societies that use collaborative knowledge sharing and resource management techniques to increase food production and rural prosperity. These organizations adopted experimental methodologies, collective decision-making processes, and community cooperation approaches that were clearly influenced by innovations these survival networks had pioneered centuries earlier. Agricultural societies in England used crop rotation trials and systematic documentation methods that reflected the empirical observation techniques these women had developed for testing and refining survival strategies. Farming communities in France implemented resource pooling arrangements for purchasing improved livestock and equipment that followed patterns these survival networks had established for collaborative resource acquisition. Rural communities throughout Northern Europe adopted soil improvement techniques and pest management strategies through knowledge-sharing networks that operated using communication protocols these women had created for transmitting practical innovations across geographic distances. The agricultural revolution that increased food production and supported population growth throughout the 18th century was significantly enabled by organizational methods that trace their origins to medieval survival communities. But perhaps the most significant 18th century development was how these collaborative principles influenced the emergence of early industrial organization. Manufacturing communities that successfully adapted to changing economic conditions often used worker cooperation and resource sharing techniques that were clearly derived from survival methods these women had pioneered. Textile workers in England developed mutual aid societies that provided support during economic downturns using assistance protocols that followed patterns these survival networks had established for maintaining community members during resource shortages. Mining communities used safety cooperation and knowledge-sharing systems that reflected collaborative problem-solving approaches these women had created for addressing dangerous survival conditions. Early industrial cooperatives implemented decision-making processes and resource allocation methods that were obviously adapted from organizational techniques these survival communities had developed for managing collective resources while maintaining individual incentives for contribution and innovation. The cooperative movement that would eventually influence economic development throughout the 19th and 20th centuries had roots in survival innovations these medieval women had created centuries earlier. The American Revolution provided another dramatic example of how these collaborative principles emerged during genuine survival challenges. Colonial communities that successfully resisted British authority often used organization methods that were remarkably similar to techniques these medieval survival networks had developed for operating outside official control while maintaining internal stability. Revolutionary committees implemented resource sharing and communication networks that followed patterns these women had established for coordinating community responses to external threats. Continental Army units that maintained effectiveness despite supply shortages used collaborative resource management and morale maintenance techniques that were clearly derived from survival methods these communities had pioneered. Colonial women who supported the revolutionary effort through economic boycotts and resource conservation used cooperative organization approaches that were strikingly similar to methods these medieval survival networks had developed for collective action while avoiding direct confrontation with authorities. The success of these revolutionary activities depended significantly on collaborative skills that traced their origins to innovations these women had created centuries earlier. The French Revolution revealed similar patterns as urban communities that survived the economic and political chaos of the revolutionary period consistently used resource management and community organization techniques that reflected survival methods these medieval women had pioneered. Neighborhood committees that maintained food distribution during supply crises implemented rationing and allocation systems that were essentially identical to approaches these survival networks had used during resource shortages. Women's organizations that emerged during the revolutionary period used collective decision-making and conflict resolution procedures that clearly descended from governance innovations these medieval communities had developed. The revolutionary government's attempts to implement new social policies often succeeded only when they incorporated collaborative principles that reflected organizational approaches these survival networks had established. But the revolutionary period also demonstrated the continuing tension between collaborative principles and hierarchical power structures. When revolutionary leaders consolidated political control, they typically abandoned cooperative approaches in favor of centralized authority systems that excluded the collaborative participation that had enabled revolutionary success in the first place. This pattern of adopting collaborative methods during crisis periods and then abandoning them once power was secured continued to appear throughout European and American history. The survival innovations these medieval women had developed kept re-emerging whenever communities faced genuine challenges that required cooperative responses, but they were consistently suppressed once hierarchical authorities felt secure enough to prioritize control over effectiveness. The 19th century brought new applications through the development of labor organization and social reform movements that used collaborative principles these women had established centuries earlier. Workers who organized for improved conditions used mutual aid systems, collective decision-making processes, and resource-sharing arrangements that were clearly derived from survival techniques these communities had pioneered. Labor unions implemented strike support and community assistance programs using cooperation methods that followed patterns these survival networks had established for maintaining community members during resource shortages. Social reform organizations used collaborative problem-solving and systematic documentation approaches that reflected empirical methodologies these women had developed for testing and refining practical solutions. Women's suffrage movements adopted organization techniques and communication networks that were obviously adapted from methods these medieval survival communities had used for coordinating collective action while maintaining security from official interference. The success of these reform movements depended significantly on collaborative skills that had originated in survival innovations these women had created centuries earlier. Educational reform initiatives throughout the 19th century incorporated learning approaches that reflected teaching methods these survival networks had developed for transmitting practical knowledge through hands-on experience and collaborative problem-solving. Progressive educators who emphasized experiential learning and community cooperation were unknowingly applying pedagogical principles these women had established through necessity centuries earlier. Public health improvements that reduced disease and mortality rates in industrial cities used community organization and resource management techniques that were clearly influenced by methods these survival communities had developed for maintaining health during resource-constrained conditions. The sanitation systems and healthcare networks that supported urban population growth reflected organizational innovations these women had pioneered for survival purposes. The 20th century brought the most dramatic applications of these collaborative principles through responses to global crises that required community cooperation on unprecedented scales. Communities that successfully survived the Great Depression consistently used resource sharing, mutual aid, and collective problem-solving approaches that were remarkably similar to techniques these medieval women had developed for surviving economic hardship. Neighborhood organizations that maintained social stability during economic collapse implemented assistance programs and resource distribution systems that followed patterns these survival networks had established for managing community resources during shortage conditions. Rural communities that weathered agricultural failures used cooperative farming and resource pooling arrangements that were clearly derived from collaborative techniques these women had pioneered. World War II brought even more striking applications as civilian populations facing wartime shortages and dangers adopted survival strategies that were essentially identical to methods these medieval communities had developed centuries earlier. Urban populations that survived bombing campaigns used shelter sharing and resource conservation techniques that reflected approaches these women had established for surviving harsh environmental conditions. Resistance movements throughout occupied Europe used organization methods, communication networks, and resource management systems that were obviously adapted from survival techniques these communities had pioneered for operating outside official control while maintaining internal effectiveness. The success of civilian resistance during the war depended significantly on collaborative skills that traced their origins to innovations these medieval women had created. Women who maintained households and communities while male populations were absent during military service spontaneously developed cooperative systems that were strikingly similar to arrangements these survival networks had used. The effectiveness of these wartime women's organizations provided additional evidence that collaborative approaches based on principles these medieval communities had established were more effective than hierarchical systems for addressing genuine survival challenges. The post-war development of international cooperation organizations reflected collaborative principles these women had pioneered centuries earlier. The United Nations implemented decision-making processes and resource coordination systems that were clearly influenced by methods these survival communities had developed for managing collective resources while respecting individual community